This week we're going to be focusing on the earliest American history, specifically for pre-Columbian through Spanish, early colonization. So the question that often comes up then is, who discovered the Americas? And the easiest answer to that is the first peoples, Native Americans. The estimation is that they migrated to the Americas sometime from about 13,000 to 40,000 years ago, coming from the North Asian landmass, modern-day Siberia, coming over to modern-day Alaska, probably via a short boat trip. And very quickly after that, they were able to migrate south, inhabiting both North and South America. So the question of who discovered America would be Native Americans. But then the question comes up, why do we pay so much attention to Columbus, and is he the first to contact the Americas since they were discovered? And the short answer to that is no, he's not the first. There are several groups, at least two, that have viable claims to having contacted North American people before Columbus's Europeans made it. So the first group that is generally considered to be proven to have contacted North America are the Vikings or the Norse. And they did that around the year 1000 of the Common Era. You might know it as AD. So about the Middle Ages in Europe. The evidence for this was largely discounted for a long time because it came from an oral history called the Icelandic sagas. The Vikings and the Norse people had an oral tradition, and typically in U.S. history, or just in history in general, oral traditions are not seen as credible as writing because they can change over time just based on the traditions. In this case, the Icelandic sagas were written about 150 years after the quote-unquote discovery of North America. This happened based on a chain of events. So the Norse had already settled Iceland, and one of their people, Eric the Red, was exiled about 20 years prior, so in 980 CE. He was exiled for manslaughter, and he traveled west, and he ended up finding a land that he called Greenland, which is covered in ice and snow. So he called it Greenland in an effort to get more people to settle in his new colony. And for the most part, it worked. Plus, at that point in time, the world was going through a warmer period, so the entire area was much more habitable. So we have an establishment of Norse people in Greenland during this time period. One of the ships that was coming from Iceland to Greenland ended up getting blown off course in 985, so about 5 years after Eric the Red was exiled. And it got blown so far off course that the captain said that he spotted a new unknown landmass. He never really landed because he was a merchant ship and a group of settlers, not an explorer. But when he ended up being able to correct his course when the winds changed, and he eventually did make it to Greenland, those rumors kind of spread throughout that colony. And so by the time we get to 1000 CE, Eric the Red's son, Leif Erikson, leads an expedition to try and see if these rumors are true. And what he and his crew discover are 3 land masses that they named Helluland, the land of flat stones, which is considered to be the modern-day Baffin Islands, Markland, the land of forests, which is modern-day Labrador, and Vinland, the land of meadows, which is considered to be modern-day Newfoundland. So all of them in northern Canada. Leif Erikson's crew ended up staying the winter in Vinland, where they reported a lot of thriving agriculture. So they reported seeing gooseberries and cranberries growing wild, but they only stay for about a year before they return because Leif Erikson is next in line, and so he ends up going back to be by his father's side in Greenland. His younger brother ends up taking an expedition a few years later. So this is Thorvald Eriksson. He ends up landing, and when they land, they encounter 9 Native Americans sleeping under their canoes, and the Vikings attack them to try and make sure that they'll be safe. But they only kill 8 of the 9 Native Americans, and the one that escapes ends up mounting an attack party to come back and attack the Vikings. They ended up actually killing Thorvald Eriksson. His party stays there throughout the winter, but they are under constant attack by Native Americans, and so they end up leaving. And that seems to be almost the end of it until about 5 years later, an entirely new group of people, about 200 people, strike out to try and settle this new land. They take men, women, and livestock. So the indication is very clear that they tried to create a lasting settlement. The problems that they end up having is that they're under near constant attack from Native Americans, and while there is evidence that there was trading, that trade eventually broke down, and those incessant attacks by Native Americans ended up driving the Norse back out of North America, so their settlement doesn't last. The idea with this is that you have to prove that this happened, because this is all just said in oral saga. So the proof for this is actually in archaeological evidence. In the 1970s, there is actually excavation of a town in Lances on Meadows that's found in Newfoundland. So there's proof that there are Viking settlements that match the settlements from Greenland of the same time period, indicating that the Vikings definitively made it to North America and attempted to settle it in the early part of the 1000s. There is claims in the sagas that for the next 400 years, Greenland settlers returned to Markland to trade, but there is no definitive proof of that. So we do have that contact that happens pre-Columbian. The other group that is likely to have encountered Native Americans in North America, actually in this case South America, would be the Polynesians. So this is, unlike the Vikings, which are proven, the Polynesians are very likely, but not definitively proven. The reason for that I'll kind of get into as we go, but the Polynesians are exceptionally prowess mariners. The areas that they discover, or at least encounter, such as Hawaii and Easter Islands, are so impossibly far away from their homeland that it's just as likely that if they could make it there, they could make it to the Americas. So the several thousand miles that it takes to make it to places like Hawaii or to the Easter Islands means that if they could settle there for a while, they could make it another couple thousand miles to North America, specifically South America in modern-day Chile. The evidence that we have for this is actually in food. So we have two items that get crossed. One is chicken. Chickens are not native to the Americas. They are actually pretty much everywhere else, just not in the Americas. And there is evidence of chicken bones found in El Arnal, a Chilean dig site in southern Chile. All of the chicken bones found in the Americas were assumed to be from 1492 or later. And to be from Chile, they would have to actually be closer to the mid-1500s or later. So when they carbon dated these bones, it was actually found that those chicken bones were from about 1304 to 1424, well before Columbus actually voyaged. And when they DNA sampled the chicken bones, they found that those chickens were more closely related to chickens from Pacific islands like Tonga, American Samoa, Hawaii, or the Easter Islands than they were to European variants. So there's strong evidence that Polynesians brought them to the Americas, and that is also substantiated by the other food that was transferred, and that's sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes are native to the Americas, and yet despite that fact, when Europeans traveled to Pacific islands in the 16 to 1800s, they found that sweet potatoes already existed on those islands as part of staple food. Sweet potatoes are difficult to transport, kind of like chickens. Chickens can't fly. They need to be taken by humans. Sweet potatoes are not something that you can grow from seed. You have to kind of grow them from the actual plant itself. So to get these plants to all these different Pacific islands, the likelihood is it needs someone to take them. And so there's two theories. Number one, that Native Americans themselves traveled to these other islands, or number two, that Polynesians did it. The evidence for it being Polynesians is twofold. Number one, their maritime prowess is already well vetted. And number two, the name for sweet potato is the same in Polynesian and in South American dialects, indicating that they would have learned the name and gotten the plants from Native Americans and then taken them with them back on their voyages throughout the Pacific. So with that in mind, please just know that we're going to be looking at pre-Columbian societies throughout this week. And then we're also going to look at why the Columbus quote-unquote discovery of America is so influential. See you in class tomorrow.